Hello guys, today we'll talk about the medicinal chemistry of the agents used for treating asthma and COPD, in particular the steroids and the bronchodilators. And I have split this material into two parts. So we'll talk about part one today, and then we'll talk about part two on the next day, which is February 16. So first of all, any comments or notes I mention in the video, if they are not written in the material, then it will be for your own education. You'll only be responsible for the written handout, okay? But the video, of course, should help you understand the handout. Okay, so as you go through the material or listen to the video, I hope you'll be able to get these objectives. The first one is to understand the general approaches that are used in treating the bronchoconstriction and inflammation. As you will see, the signs of the um, asthma and in particular the COPD are bronchoconstriction and inflammation. So make sure you know the mechanism of the formation of bronchoconstriction and inflammation and how drugs are being designed to fight these two symptoms. And then also relate the HPA suppression mechanism to the reason why steroids should not be stopped abruptly. Also identify the three pharmacological actions of glucocorticoids. As you will see, what makes glucocorticoids unique in um, their use as anti-inflammatory is that they have three different actions that they exert, unlike the case of for example, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, where they only stop the inflammation. Glucocorticoids have three different actions. One of them is stop the inflammation, but there is other two. I want you to look at these three actions, and then identify the interactions that takes place between the glucocorticoid and its receptor, in particular the halogen bonds, and then define the reason why do we design different glucocorticoids. What is the goal when we design these glucocorticoids? As you will see, one of the goals is to increase the anti-inflammatory and reduce the side effects resulting from the water and sodium retention, plus enhancing the pharmacokinetic properties, and of course the um, other features of having longer duration of action, etc., which is actually part of pharmacokinetics, so it's the same. And then relate the structure activity relationship studies to their effects on the glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoid properties. So you're going to see a graph that shows how the modifications of that structure can enhance the glucocorticoids and hopefully reduce the mineralocorticoids properties and reduce the side effect coming from the mineralocorticoids property. And then identify the metabolic regions for the glucocorticoids and how modifications of these regions or stratification of these regions can prevent the metabolism of the glucocorticoids and increase their duration of action. And then list the regions where stratification is possible. Identify which region is the easiest to stratify. As you will see, there are three different regions where stratification is possible. One of these regions is actually the most accessible, so find out which region is that. Okay, and also relate the structure activity relationship studies as well as the stratification process to their effect on the selectivity of the glucocorticoid drugs to their receptor, okay, as well as the effect on potency, resistance to metabolism, duration of action, onset of action, and whether this would make them a prodrug or keep them active as drugs, as well as their ability to produce local versus systemic effects. And then when you look at the next class, which is the beta 2 agonists, make sure you know the pathways available for the norepinephrine after it binds to the receptor. What is the fate of the norepinephrine after it binds to the receptor, how it is being metabolized, and then highlight the structural features of the norepinephrine that are involved in the binding of the receptor, So basically look at these interactions between the norepinephrine and the receptor, and then relate how these features affect the selectivity and how they affect the mechanism of action. As you will see, there are 3 different ways the beta agonists can actually exert their action, and then identify the substituents responsible for increasing the resistance to the COMT and the MAO enzyme, and those responsible for increasing the lipophilicity, and of course differentiate between the short and long-acting molecules based only on their structure. Finally, identify the structural feature that's been added to the acetylcholine that resulted into the antimuscarinic activity. So apparently, when we talk about the class of antimuscarinic, which has the endogenous molecule called acetylcholine binding to it, so in order to prevent that receptor from producing its action, its bronchoconstriction action, we designed an antagonist to that receptor. So how did we modify the acetylcholine to make it become an antagonist? Okay, so what feature did we add to this molecule? And good luck. Okay, let's start with a brief introduction. Although you can read this by yourself, but let me just give you the important points. Allergic asthma, or actually asthma, can be classified into 2 kinds. One of them is the allergic asthma, which is the most common, also known as atopic or extrinsic asthma. And then we also have the less common one, the intrinsic asthma. Most important is that COPD is highly associated with smoking, unlike the case of the asthma. And the rest you could read for your own. I'm sure you have learned about that in the pathophysiology and pharmacology. Let's have an overview look at the pharmacological methods used in treating asthma and COPD. First of all, the symptoms of asthma are caused by bronchoconstriction and inflammation, and therefore it would make sense, of course, to treat each of these symptoms. So normally, in the case of no problems in the normal lung, you will have a balance between the vasoconstriction effect from the cholinergic system. So the parasympathetic is the one that causes the cholinergic effect, the bronchoconstriction, and then there's also the sympathetic effect or the adrenergic effect, which causes the bronchodilation. Normally, you have a balance between these two, and the parasympathetic is actually, in normal conditions, are the one that is most commonly affecting the lung, not just the lung, but all these systems. So if we look at this graph here, each one of your organs are actually fed by 2 systems, the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic system. The sympathetic, of course, known as the fight or flight system, which is also called adrenergic system, and the parasympathetic is the one that's dominating in the case of the in normal cases. Okay, so and it's also called the cholinergic system. So here's your lungs, and there's a balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic. The parasympathetic is causing vasoconstriction. The sympathetic is causing the parasympathetic is causing bronchoconstriction. The sympathetic is causing bronchodilation. There's a balance, although the parasympathetic is has stronger effects or more effect on the lung. Okay, so in order to treat the bronchoconstriction, as you can imagine, there are 2 options. One of them is to block the parasympathetic effect such that the sympathetic effect will be stronger and will dominate. Or another way is to strengthen the sympathetic effect, the adrenergic effect. So you administer more of the adrenergic drugs, and then you have more of the bronchodilation. And this figure here shows how there's always a balance between these 2. Normally it's the parasympathetic, but then in the case of flight or fight, then you have the sympathetic effect dominating, which is the adrenergic. Okay. The anti-inflammatory effects seen in asthma are resulting from the release of physiologically active chemicals from different inflammatory cells. And then, as we will see, to treat the inflammation, one way is to administer anti-inflammatory drugs, or to stabilize the mast cells, which have granules that inside these granules they release, there are chemicals that cause the inflammation, such as histamine and serotonin, etc. So we will talk about that soon. So making stabilizing the mast cells. And then we could also use leukotriene modifiers. And there's also the anti-IgE antigen antibody, which we'll talk about soon also. This graph here again shows the mechanism of the inflammation and the bronchoconstriction and dilation, and how these drugs could be used. In the first part here, you have a balance between the adrenergic system and cholinergic, as I explained earlier. And then your goal is to either enhance the adrenergic effect to cause bronchodilation, or block the cholinergic effect such that the adrenergic effect can take over and bronchodilation occurs. This part here, the bottom part of the graph, shows that when an antigen interacts with an antibody, it forms a complex, and then it affects mast cells and leads to release of the leukotrienes, histamine, prostaglandins, and therefore the treatment options available could be preventing the binding of the antibody with the antigen, as we'll see with the anti-IgE antibody, or stabilizing the mast cells such that it does not release these. So we have mast cell stabilizers. Other options are to inhibit the synthesis or the binding of these leukotrienes to its receptor. And if you remember, the antihistamine was controversial when it comes to the treatment of asthma. And then we have the prostaglandins. We could administer prostaglandins inhibitors, or as in the case of the corticosteroids, they can prevent the synthesis of the prostaglandins. So we'll talk about all these classes, which are also listed here. So we have the adrenocorticoids, which is corticosteroids, and then we have the beta-2 agonists, which is adrenergic. We have antimuscarinic, which is the anticholinergic, and then we have the xanthine, which actually causes bronchodilation, and then we have leukotriene modifiers, like we mentioned here, mast cell degranulation inhibitors, which is another name for mast cell stabilizers, and then we have the monoclonal anti-IgE antibody, and then finally the phosphodiesterase inhibitors, which causes smooth muscle relaxation and bronchodilation. So we'll visit all these. Okay. This paragraph here in gray, or these two paragraphs in gray, are for your own information. I could not resist including these, not to include these in the notes, but I'm sure you will learn more about this from the clinicians in the clinical departments. Let's start by the first class of drugs used in treating asthma and COPD. These are the adrenocorticoids. They are actually a type of steroids, and steroids can be divided into four major classes. The adrenocorticoids, the ones we'll talk about in this lecture, and then the sex hormones, the bile acids, and vitamins. Among these four classes, adrenocorticoids, the ones we'll talk about, are normally formed or synthesized in the cortex of the adrenal. I'm sure you learned about this in the pathophysiology and pharmacology. And these adrenocorticoids can be divided further into two classes, the glucocorticoids and the mineralocorticoids. The glucocorticoids are named glucocorticoids because they affect the glucose synthesis and metabolism, and that's where the name gluco comes from. And yet they have a significant anti-inflammatory effect. The mineralocorticoids, they affect minerals such as sodium, and of course, when you affect sodium, you can affect the water. So the mineralocorticoids affect the sodium and the water retention. Okay, and because we're interested in the anti-inflammatory effect, we'll only talk about the glucocorticoids. Okay, now you should notice that the glucocorticoids, since they affect the sugar, they should be cautioned in people with diabetes. So normally anytime you take glucocorticoids, the sugar increases, the glucose level in the body, in the blood increases, and therefore people with diabetes should be cautioned about that. Okay. On the other hand, the mineralocorticoids causes retention of the water and sodium in the body, and they would increase the blood volume, and this means they can increase the blood pressure, and therefore they should be cautioned if they are used with people. People who have hypertension should be cautioned if they are using the mineralocorticoids. Okay. Let's talk about the steroid nomenclature. Basically, all steroids are composed of this nucleus, which is 4 rings connected together. One of them is a 5-membered ring. And in the case of the glucocorticoids, they have CH3 at position number 10, another CH3 methyl at position number 13, and an ethyl group at position 17. And all of them should also have an OH group at position 11 and 17, as well as 21. And there must be also a double bond right here in ring A. There should be at least one double bond here. The way these rings are connected together is in a cis conformation. If you don't remember the cis and trans conformation of these rings, you could review your organic chemistry, or you probably don't have to worry about it. And then we also have 2 faces for the molecule. One of them is basically looking at the molecule from one side. The other one is if you are looking at the back of this page. So, and normally the face that binds to the receptor is the beta face. Okay. Glucocorticoids should also have a keto group, C double bond O, at position C20, as well as position C3. In fact, this here structure, which was a typical glucocorticoids, is the structure of hydrocortisone, which we will use as our reference or our point for comparison when we talk about the other glucocorticoids. Okay, let's briefly talk about the synthesis and secretion of steroids. Steroids are synthesized from cholesterol, which is obtained from the diet. About 0.3 gram is taken from the diet per day, while in fact the majority is synthesized from acetates in the liver. About 1 gram of the cholesterol is synthesized by our body in the liver. So once the cholesterol is available, then the adrenocorticoids are formed and are secreted into the blood, the circulation, and their levels in the blood is maintained or controlled by the negative feedback mechanism, or a feedback mechanism, as you see in this graph here. So you have the basically the hydrocortisone here being synthesized. It goes through this what's called hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, that leads to the synthesis of the hydrocortisone. And then once it's in the circulation, their level in the blood gives a feedback mechanism to these hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland to stop the synthesis. So you have a negative feedback mechanism, and this is the mechanism through which the synthesis and release of these corticosteroids, the glucocorticoids, and all these adrenocorticoids being synthesized. What is important to know is that the chronic use of corticosteroids would cause suppression for these glands, of course, from releasing the adrenocorticoids, and therefore, if you stop the hydrocortisone immediately or abruptly, suddenly, then um, these glands, they will need some time to produce the hydrocortisone. So then your body would be out of the hydrocortisone or the steroids necessary to function normally, and then that can cause problems and maybe some life-threatening effects. That's why if you have noticed in your pharmacy, you would see the 6 days and 12 days of the withdrawal dose pack. If you noticed, we start with a higher dose, and then you will have to stop this cortisone gradually. You have the 6 days or 12 days, and then you start with higher dose, and then you slowly stop the cortisone just to give these glands the time to synthesize the cortisone again. Okay. Let's now talk about the mechanism of action of glucocorticoids and how they exert their anti-inflammatory effects. They actually have three major ways of reducing the inflammation, and that's why they are actually useful in the asthma and COPD. If you'd like, compare these mechanisms to, for example, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. You'd see that in the case of the glucocorticoids, besides stopping the inflammation, they actually inhibit the cytokines, which leads to other responses, stimulation of the white blood cells, okay, and they also inhibit the release of chemicals known as autocoids from the mast cell. So it's because of these three major actions of the glucocorticoids. The glucocorticoids are preferred to be used in the case of asthma and COPD. Anyway, so the first one, the anti-inflammatory effect of the glucocorticoids is by stimulating the synthesis of a protein called lipocortin. This protein inhibits phospholipase A2 enzyme. This enzyme, phospholipase A2, is responsible for converting the phospholipids that comes from the degradation of the cell membranes into the arachidonic acid. Now, this arachidonic acid plays an important role in being synthesized, in synthesizing other chemicals, such as the leukotrienes, as we'll see, which are important in causing bronchoconstriction, and the arachidonic acid is also involved in the synthesis of prostaglandins that leads to the inflammation. So by blocking this step, we can actually inhibit a lot of chemicals that are involved in the inflammation and bronchoconstriction. Okay, so that's one action for the glucocorticoids. The other action for glucocorticoids is that they inhibit interleukin-1. Apparently interleukin-1 plays a role in stimulating the white blood cells, T and B lymphocytes, which leads to production of immune responses, inflammation, and therefore by inhibiting the IL-1 interleukin, these proliferation or these white blood cells or lymphocytes, they're not able to cause the further immune responses and inflammation. And this is why, in fact, one of the reasons the glucocorticoids should be used carefully if somebody has an infection, because they cause immunosuppression. Okay, so just keep that in mind. There has been some drug-disease interaction for the use of glucocorticoids. We have talked about the use of glucocorticoids in diabetic patients, since they cause increase of the glucose. We also talked about the use of the mineral corticoids, not the glucocorticoids, the use of mineral corticoids in people with hypertension because they would cause water and sodium retention. And a third example here is if somebody has infection, then the use of glucocorticoids can reduce their immunity. Okay. And the third mechanism of action for the glucocorticoids is the fact that they inhibit the mast cell from synthesis and release of autocoids such as histamine and other chemicals such as serotonin and other chemicals. I can't remember their names now. Anyway. So how do these glucocorticoids or adrenocorticoids in general play its role? How do they control all these functions that we mentioned earlier? Apparently, these steroids can increase or decrease the synthesis of proteins in our cell. If you remember, the way the proteins are being synthesized is through the transcription and translation of the DNA, the mRNA. So these adrenocorticoids, they interfere with the DNA and they cause either increase or decrease in the synthesis of these essential proteins, and then these proteins will lead to the effects that we have seen previously, like in the case of the lipoprotein. We have seen that I'm sorry, I meant in the case of the lipocortin, we have seen that glucocorticoids stimulate the synthesis of lipocortin, which inhibits the enzyme phospholipase A2. Okay, so this is how these glucocorticoids exert their functions. I want you to remember the types of receptors. If you remember, we had enzymes and we had receptors. Some receptors are membrane bound, others are bind to the nucleus, or actually enter the nucleus and binds to the DNA. So those that enter the nucleus are called nuclear receptors. And so glucocorticoids, they bind to the kind of receptors that are known as nuclear receptors. Let me have you watch this video just to have an idea of this graph, which is how these glucocorticoids bind to the receptor and how to the nuclear receptors, and then the nuclear receptors affect the synthesis of protein. Okay.
Glucocorticoid hormones are steroid hormones that influence nutrient metabolism. These hormones activate genes for proteins involved in processes such as the synthesis of glucose, the breakdown of proteins, and the mobilization of fat. Glucocorticoid hormones are secreted by endocrine glands into the bloodstream. They enter cells through transporters in the plasma membrane. Once inside the cytosol, the hormone molecules can bind to glucocorticoid receptors, which function as transcription factors that activate genes. The binding of the hormone causes proteins that were bound to the receptor, such as the heat shock protein HSP90, to be released. Release of HSP90 allows two receptors to bind and form a dimer, as well as exposing a nuclear localization signal on the receptor. The receptor dimer is then allowed to enter into the nucleus through a nuclear pore. The receptor dimer is able to bind to specific DNA sequence regions called glucocorticoid response elements, or GREs, that are near target genes. The GREs function as enhancers, so that binding of a receptor dimer to a GRE activates transcription of the nearby target gene.
So now that we know the type of receptor these glucocorticoids bind to, let's talk about how these glucocorticoids bind and form interactions at the binding site with these nuclear receptors. This shows the example of the glucocorticoid. I believe it's the hydrocortisone, and these surrounding amino acids, as you remember, most of the receptors are actually proteins, and proteins are made of amino acids. So we have the ASN, I think it's the asparagine amino acid, and the number next to it shows the rank or the order of that amino acid. So proteins are made of chains of amino acids, and the chain goes from 1 to whatever the number of amino acids there, let's say 700 for example. So you have one of them, the ASN, and you have the threonine amino acid, you have the glycine, actually I think it's the glutamine amino acids, and then the arginine. Anyway, I'm not concerned about the types of amino acids. I want you to pay attention that the majority of the interactions are actually hydrophilic. Are actually hydrogen bonds. So you have hydrogen bond here, 2 hydrogen bonds here forming with this double bond O, and you have hydrogen bond here forming with the OH, another hydrogen bond forming with the other ketone, C double bond O, another hydrogen bond here and here. So these hydrogen bonds are responsible for making the strong binding affinity of this molecule to its receptor. Okay, there are actually hydrophobic interactions resulting from these carbons and the nucleus being, the nature of the nucleus being hydrophobic. So there is hydrophobic interactions as well, but the stronger ones are the hydrogen bonds, and they actually form with every single hydrophilic group, basically the OH groups and the C double bond O that are in the glucocorticoids. In case you are wondering why should I care about these interactions, well, apparently, as you will see, that the loss of these groups will result into inactive drugs. Okay, in particular, this one here, the 21, the OH group here, the OH21, the loss of this hydrogen bond here has shown great loss in the activity of the glucocorticoids, but we'll also see the importance of these groups as well with the examples of the glucocorticoids. Let's now talk about the structure-activity relationships for the glucocorticoids. First of all, since glucocorticoids and the mineralocorticoids they belong to the same class of adrenocorticoids, so there's some cross effects between these two, meaning that glucocorticoids, besides the fact that they are anti-inflammatory, they can also cause water and sodium retention. So our goal is to synthesize glucocorticoids that only have anti-inflammatory effects and no or less mineralocorticoid effect, which is the water retention and sodium. So again, the natural glucocorticoids, they can interact with the mineralocorticoid receptors and therefore cause salt and water retention property. And our goal is to decrease this mineralocorticoid effect by designing molecules that only specifically bind to the glucocorticoid receptor, but not to the mineralocorticoid receptor. Another goal when designing these drugs is to enhance the pharmacokinetic properties, things like absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, duration of action. So we're going to talk about this as well when we design these drugs. And this can be accomplished by increasing or decreasing the lipophilic property by adding ester groups. First of all, there are some function groups that are essential for both the glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids properties. These are basically the skeleton. The steroid skeleton should be in the trans. These cycles that are connected to form the skeleton should be connected in the trans formation, and there should be a double bond O ketone here with a double bond here. We refer to it as the delta 4, meaning that it connects carbon number 4 and 5 together. Okay, and there should be also be a double bond here, ketone, and the OH group here on the 21. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is the trans. So you have trans ketone on the number 3, ketone on number 20, OH on number 21, double bond here. These are all essentials for both activities. And the OH here on the 21 is like we mentioned, is essential for both mineral or corticoid property, except there is one exception group that could be used instead of the OH, which is the SCH2F, the fluoromethyl thioester. That group would also that's the only exception where this group can be used instead of the OH, and the activity for both structures will be the activity would still be retained for both the anti-inflammatory and mineralocorticoid activity. Now, all these other features can be actually summarized in this figure. Okay, and I noticed that the simplest way to look at this table, the figure or table, is by looking at the position of these function groups, like for example 17 alpha, 9 fluorine, or 9 chlorine, or 21 hydroxyl, and maybe try to disregard the triangle and the circle and the square thing and the closed circle thing. I think this might be easier to read this table, but it's up to you, whichever is convenient for you. So let's read this table together. First of all, for both anti-inflammatory and mineralocorticoid activity to increase, these features here, adding an OH group at the 17 alpha, or adding a fluorine at 9, or chlorine at 9, or OH at 21, all these will actually enhance both the anti-inflammatory and mineralocorticoid. Okay, now remember our goal is to enhance the anti-inflammatory effects, okay, but decrease the mineralocorticoid activity, which is reflected by these two columns. So the next column is increasing the anti-inflammatory effects, and the third one is any substitution that follows this column here would lead to decrease in the mineralocorticoid activity. So in order to increase the anti-inflammatory effect and decrease the mineralocorticoid activity, we need a combination of these two. So first, for example, to increase the anti-inflammatory effect, at position 1 we should have dihydro. Dihydro here means that position 1 should have a double bond. Okay, and then at position 6 we can have a fluorine right here, position 6, if we add a fluorine, and at position 11 if we add an OH group, then right here if we add an OH group, then any of these would actually increase the anti-inflammatory. I'm sorry, I pointed at position 1 here, I meant here. This is position 1. So at position 1, if we remove the hydrogen, then basically if we remove the hydrogen here, it means we can add double bond here between these two atoms. So basically having another double bond here besides this one here. Okay, so dihydro, double bond here, fluorine at position 6, or OH at position 11. Any of these would increase the anti-inflammatory. What would be nice if we can do these plus these, adding CH3 at C alpha, 6 alpha. Where is 6 alpha? Here we go, adding CH3 here, or at 16 if we add CH3, either way, alpha or beta. And by the way, alpha and beta is just basically like adding a group that that's pointing towards you, up up the screen, or pointing away from you, which is away from the screen. And at 16 and 17, adding an acetonide or an OH group. So you have any of these at 16, CH3, acetonide, or OH group. A methylene here, that would decrease the mineralocorticoid. If we combine these two together, then we could have some nice products that have glucocorticoid activity, anti-inflammatory, and would have little or decreased mineralocorticoid activity, the water retention and sodium retention. Okay. I should also mention that by adding a double bond at C1 here, the ring will be flattened. When you have a ring that has a double bond here with the ketone, then the ring would no longer look like a chair or a boat, if you remember your organic chemistry. So the ring would be flattened. So here, this sentence here would say that the activity of the anti-inflammatory effect increase by flattening the ring by adding a double bond to the C1. Then that's what is meant by flattening the ring, which is adding a double bond here. Okay. And please notice that anytime we say this sign here, the delta, the little triangle here, 1, it means 1 and 2, a double bond is added between this number here and the next number. For example, here, this delta, this little triangle, when you have 4, it means a double bond is added between 4 and 5. Okay. And these drugs here are examples of glucocorticoids that have both anti-inflammatory and the mineralocorticoid activity, the water sodium retention. These examples are hydrocortisone, cortisone, prednisone, prednisolone. While these compounds here that were synthesized to have increased glucocorticoid activity, the anti-inflammatory, and little or maybe none of the mineralocorticoid activity. Examples are triamcinolone, methylprednisolone, fluticasone, beclomethasone, budesonide, mometasone, and cyclosonide. So this will conclude the structure-activity relationship for the glucocorticoids. I just want to let you know that I do not expect you to memorize any of these SAR feature. What I do want you to be able to do is, if you are given this table, make sure you are able to use it. Okay, so you will be given this table, for example, in one of the questions, the exam, and then you will see questions about this table, or maybe you're given the table along with the structure, and then you'll have to compare between structures based on these information. So just make sure you can read and use this table, but don't memorize it. Okay. Okay, let's now talk about the metabolism of the glucocorticoids. There are 3 major routes of metabolism, or actually 3 major reactions that could occur to the glucocorticoids. Okay, we will use the hydrocortisone as an example to represent these 3 reactions. So the first one that could occur is the reduction of the keto group here, the C double bond O. Okay, the reduction of this here, which is listed right here in this example. So reduction of the C double bond E, C double bond O, as well as the double bond here to produce this product here, which is inactive, as you can imagine. By losing the keto group and by losing the double bond here, is the ring, this whole structure become inactive. So this is accomplished by 2 enzymes, step 2 and 3, which is the hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase and the reductase enzyme. So that's the first step. And by the way, all these are inactive. The only active one is the hydrocortisone. So any of these steps will lead to production of the inactive analog. Okay, so that's the first reaction. The second one is oxidation of the C17. Here's the C17 right here. So C17 right here, where it has the OH and the C double bond O, COH. So oxidation of this, the C17, which actually requires the presence of the hydroxy group and the C double bond O, CH2OH in order to occur. So this reaction here, number 4, which is carried by the enzyme oxidase, C17 oxidase. So oxidation of this C17 requires the presence of these two groups to produce this keto form, which is again inactive. So as you can imagine, if we block the OH group here and the OH group here by some ester group, as we will see in the next page, then this process could be prevented. Now, why do we care about preventing these metabolic reactions? Because if we prevent them, we'll have a longer duration of action and you will have more effects of, the original drug. So that's the second reaction. And then the third one is the in vivo equilibrium that occurs between these two steps. Notice that in all these reactions they have one direction, which means that this is the main preferred direction for the reaction. But here, between these two, it's like an equilibrium. There's an enzyme in our liver that is called the hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, the 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. This enzyme is responsible for converting this shape to that, this structure to this, and back from this structure to this. So it's an equilibrium between the two. Okay. What happens is at the carbon 11, and instead of the OH group, it's converted to a double bond ketone. Okay. And if you go back and check the OH group here, it's important to form hydrogen bond interaction. It's actually a hydrogen bond donor, while here is a hydrogen bond acceptor. So this would be inactive, while this will be active. In fact, this explains why hydrocortisone is active while the cortisone is inactive. But then once the cortisone is given, because sometimes they are given in the form of cortisone, once they are given in the cortisone form, the enzyme levels will convert this drug into that, so we'll have the active form. Okay, so this could be an example of a prodrug. So again, all of them are inactive except for this. And as you see in this figure, these structures could be, converted from one to another in different orders. So you might have this step first, and then followed by this step, followed by that, or you could, consider all the possibilities. Okay, so just look at them in general, try to compare them. And again, do not memorize any of these structures, just use that information, understand how each reaction occurs and why they lose their activity, and how we can prevent some of these reactions to increase the duration of action for the glucocorticoids. Okay, so now that we know the structure-active relationship and how these glucocorticoids are metabolized, we're going to use our favorite way of enhancing the activity and the pharmacokinetic properties for these drugs. So besides modifying and adding some function groups to enhance the activity, the anti-inflammatory activity, and reducing the mineralocorticoid activity, another way to enhance the pharmacokinetic properties is by using esters. So we will see that we will be using ester groups to either increase or decrease lipophilicity. Both will be favored in some, depending on the case. to enhance features such as the local activity, increase the local activity, reduce the side effects, reduce the systemic absorption, you increase duration of action, and so forth. Okay, and also the onset, slowing the onset of action if needed. So this is the structure again. This is our glucocorticoids, and in order to add an ester group, we look for an OH group. So think about all the OH groups that were available on the structure that you have, and you will in the original structure, and you will find that there was 3 hydroxyl groups, one at 11 at C11, another at C17, another at C21. Okay, and you will see that the easiest one to add an ester group, because we're gonna basically perform a reaction, a synthetic reaction to add an ester group to one of these OHs. So we have here C11, 17, and this here is the OH at C21. You will see that the easiest one to add an ester group to is C21, because it's actually the most accessible. And the reason it's the most accessible because it's the farthest away from the nucleus here, due to this arm here. So it has because of this arm, it makes it away from this bulky group, and you can easily esterify, add an ester group to it. While this one here, OH, is very close to the this bulky steroid ring. The same applies to this OH here. So it's really difficult to add an ester group. So 21 is the easiest because it's most accessible. Okay. Now, as you can expect, the addition of ester groups to any of these OHs will affect not only the affinity of how this glucocorticoids bind to the receptor, but they will also affect the metabolism. If you remember earlier, this OH group here and having an OH group here were required for the oxidation on C17 to occur. So if we add an ester group here, this drug will no longer be metabolized, this C17 here. So that would increase the duration of action. Also, as far as affinity, the OH group here, if it's been esterified, then again this drug will not be able to bind to the receptor. The same applies to the 21 and to the 17. So the esterification can affect the affinity of how these drugs bind to the receptors. Now, there is another unique feature about the C21, which is if we esterify the C21 here, we lose the activity, but then of course once it's in the body, the ester will be removed by esterase enzymes. So it's an example of a prodrug. Now for these, the 17 and 11, if we add an ester group, they can still have some activity. Okay, so they will still be active, but not as strong, not with a strong affinity compared to the 21. So again, the C21 here, adding of an ester to C21 here will give you a prodrug because the activity is lost. But in the case of the C11 and 17, adding an ester group will reduce the activity, but the drugs will still be active. Okay, so they're not considered prodrugs. We will see this in the examples of the drugs we will discuss. Okay, and of course the C17 hydroxy group needs to be free in order to be metabolized, so the esterification of the C17 here will prevent that reaction and will therefore increase the duration of action. So esterifying this group would prevent the reaction, again, the oxidation to this carbon. So replacing this with an ester will increase the duration of action. Okay. Also, one factor the ester groups can affect is how long these drugs stay in the body. So if we add an ester group and the drug become lipophilic, then the drug, if it's absorbed, then it will stay longer in the body before it can actually be metabolized and converted to a polar drug. Okay. Let's look at the next paragraph here. The first example of esterification that we'll talk about is the addition of a lipophilic group to the R here at C21. So all this paragraph will be about the addition of ester group to C21. Question is, why do you want to increase the lipophilicity of, in this case, why do you want to add an ester group to increase the lipophilicity? And the answer is, when you increase the lipophilicity for a glucocorticoid, then if this glucocorticoid is given locally, like for example in the case of topically administration, or in the case of the inhalation, then the drug will not be absorbed systemically because it's lipophilic. And then since it is not absorbed systemically, then you're not going to see the side effects from the systemic absorption. So that's one reason. Another reason you want to add a lipophilic group to the C21 is to increase the duration of action. How is that? Well, by making the drug lipophilic, it is not absorbed, so then it stays longer topically before it's absorbed. Another reason or another way esterifying the 21 would increase the duration of action is by adding an ester group here. First, the drug becomes inactive, and then it relies on the enzymes of the esterase enzymes. For example, in the case of the topical application, it relies on the esterase enzymes on the skin to convert this inactive drug back to the active drug. So it's now a prodrug. Okay, so and it's converted into the active drug before it exerts its action. So then this time, the time it takes for the drug or the prodrug to be converted into its active form using the esterases will make the drug stay longer, and then you will have a longer duration of action. And this would decrease the onset of action. In other words, it would take time before you can see the activity of the drug. Okay, so they will have a slow onset of action. Using an ester group to increase the duration of action applies also in the case of taking the drug orally. So when you take a drug orally, and if it's esterified at C21 here, then relying on the enzymes to convert this drug into the active form would increase the duration of action, and therefore you don't have to give the drug as frequently, which is an important factor that helps with the compliance. I want you to always keep in mind that our goal is to reduce the frequency of the drug administered. We always look for new drugs that can be given as minimum as possible, preferably once a day, but if you can even make it better, like once a week or a month, that would be ideal for compliance. Once you have the drug taken more than once a day, then it's a problem for patients to remember to take the medication. Okay. The next type of esterification are the ones achieved at position 16, 17, and 21, and these are normally achieved by adding dual esterification, meaning that you increase by adding two ester groups. You will see here, some are performed by adding an ester group at 17 and 21, like here. Others are performed by adding ester groups at 16 and 21. Some others you see ester group at 16 and 17. Okay, so you'll always see an ester group added to two of the three, 16, 17, and 21. So as you can imagine, since you are esterifying two of these groups, then the lipophilicity would be much higher than the previous case where we added only one ester group, lipophilic group. So we'll have a further enhancement in the lipophilicity, and therefore you will have a further increase in the duration of action. And in the case of the C17 being esterified, you will gonna actually have a longer duration of action, not only because the drug is now more lipophilic, but because you are preventing the C17 from being metabolized. So you're preventing one of the metabolic reactions. So you have an increased duration of action, not only because the drug is more lipophilic, but because it's now resistant to metabolism. It's now resistant to the oxidation enzyme at C17. Okay. I want you also to notice that anytime we add an ester group to the 21, the drug becomes inactive, and then now it becomes a prodrug, which means it has to be converted. Look here at 16, 21. So 16 and 21, or 17, 21, like here and here, you'll have a prodrug, as you see in brackets, because now the drug become inactive, because the 21, the OH at 21 is important for activity. While in this case here, where we added an ester group to the OH on 16 and 17, but we left the OH group free, then this one will be active form. So we, in this case here, in the case of the ketan, if it's performed on the 16 and the 17, and we left this drug and we left the OH free, then it's not a prodrug, because it could still bind to the receptor. So the 21 is essential for binding, while the 17 is not as essential. So therefore the drug is still active. Now if you add ester group to both 16, 17 and 21, so this is going to be highly super duper lipophilic, because you are esterifying 16, 17 and 21. Then it's not only lipophilic, but it's also resistant to metabolism, and because you covered the OH group here, the drug is no longer active, and it becomes a prodrug. So it needs to be esterified. It needs to be hydrolyzed by the esterase enzyme to be converted to the active form. Okay. And finally, the last example on the esterification is esterifying the 21 C21, not to increase the lipophilicity, but to increase the hydrophilicity. In other words, you're gonna add a polar group to make the drug more hydrophilic, more water soluble. Okay. And of course, since we are esterifying the OH group at the 21, we will end up having a prodrug. Now, how is that useful? In this case, we're looking for enhancing the water solubility of the glucocorticoids, as if, for example, we are trying to prepare an IV infusion. Then you need something that dissolves in the plasma, and then you need something that dissolves in water, of course. So then you would enhance the water solubility by adding an ester group here that is hydrophilic, okay, such as the phosphate group here or the succinate group. So lots of negative charges here, as you see. So that would enhance the water solubility, and these drugs will have very fast onset of action, because they are readily dissolved in the water. They can be converted quickly to the active form, and these are useful in case of emergencies, like you need a drug that can act has a fast onset of action. Then these would be the ideal drugs. What else? And they will have more side effects, because they are systemically absorbed, and they will have wide distribution. Basically because they can be systemically absorbed faster, then you'll have more side effect, unlike the ones that are lipophilic. They are not systemically absorbed, so you'll have this side effect. Anyway, so a question for you. The idea of esterifying a drug can always be used, and you will see it frequently used to increase the hydrophilicity or to increase the lipophilicity. So I want you to think about the difference between these functional groups that are added, the ester groups that are added, and try to see which ones would increase lipophilicity and which ones would increase the hydrophilicity, and what's the difference between them. Okay, just keep that in mind because this is an important concept, and try to summarize the advantages of increasing the hydrophilicity compared to the advantages of increasing the lipophilicity. Okay, so now, since we understand what are the important features of the glucocorticoids, how to increase their anti-inflammatory effect and reduce the side effect, the mineralocorticoid effect, the water retention effect, enhancing the anti-inflammatory and reducing the water retention effect, as well as how these drugs are metabolized and how to prevent their metabolism and how to enhance their lipophilicity. So all these concepts were discussed and covered in details previously, in the previous pages. Next, we're going to apply these concepts and see the examples of the drugs designed using these concepts. In fact, the next pages will talk about examples of these glucocorticoids, and if we understood everything we mentioned so far about glucocorticoids, then everything here from this page and next will be just direct application of these concepts. Okay. The first example is the hydrocortisone, which is an endogenous molecule. It's synthesized in our body, and it has both glucocorticoid and mineralocorticoid activity. And it is used as a reference by which we compare the rest of the other structures. Basically, we will be referring to the hydrocortisone and saying, for example, that prednisolone will have this much glucocorticoid activity more than the hydrocortisone, and so forth. And we'll refer to it also to compare between those that do not have mineralocorticoid activity. The essential functional groups in the hydrocortisone are the same ones mentioned earlier, which are the trans. The way these cycles should be linked is through the trans, and then the ene double bond here, the double bond here, one of the essentials, the ketone, C double bond O, the another ketone here at the 20, and then the OH at 21, and then at the 16 position, 17 OH here, and then also another OH here at the which position is that? Anyway, so this OH here is one of the essentials as well, and then the addition of hydroxy group at 11. Oh, that's 11. So this is OH 11, and then 17. This would enhance the hydroxyl. So actually, these two, the 11 and 17, are additional. So they will enhance the glucocorticoid activity, but the basics ones are the C double bond O, the OH here, the ketone, and the double bond, and of course the cis conformation of the ring. Okay. This hydrocortisone is available in many ester forms. You might actually recall seeing that in pharmacy, hydrocortisone 1% ointment and cream. I think it's also available in other oral forms, tablets, hydrocortisone. And then the clinical part here is written in gray. I'm sure you'll learn about this from clinicians and from pharmacologists. Okay, so that's all for the hydrocortisone. The next example is prednisolone. The only difference between prednisolone and the hydrocortisone is this double bond here, which causes the ring to be flattened, and by making it flattened, we would increase the glucocorticoid activity 4 times that of the hydrocortisone, and at the same time we would reduce the mineralocorticoid activity to half the activity of the hydrocortisone. This double bond also prevents one of the reactions, the metabolic reactions described earlier, and therefore it would have a longer duration of action than the hydrocortisone. Okay, and it's available in free alcohol for oral administration. I'm not sure if you noticed at the pharmacy the prednisolone, the Orapred. Prednisolone is available in oral solution. That's in the alcohol form, so it's dissolved in alcohol. And also the esterification of the C21 here would give you a prodrug, because like we said earlier, if the OH group here at the C21 is hindered or esterified, the drug becomes inactive, and then with the help of the esterase enzymes in our body, the drug will be activated again. So it's an example of a prodrug. And in the case of this prodrug, it is the phosphate that's been added as an ester to this C21 here, which makes the drug more soluble, and therefore it's used for IV infusions. Okay, and also the prednisolone has another form, which is the prednisone. So, and the only difference between prednisolone and prednisone is in the OH group here at C11, I believe. So at C11, OH group here is switched into the double bond O here by an enzyme that's available in our liver. So you could actually use prednisone, administer prednisone, and then this would act as a prodrug, and that will be converted into prednisolone, and it becomes active. It will be converted through the enzymes that are available in our liver. So this is prednisone is an example of a prodrug for prednisolone, and once it's administered, it's converted into the prednisolone. This way it takes time for the drug to be converted, and it stays longer in our body. Okay, there's a problem with that, however, which is in people who have liver dysfunction, their liver enzymes are not functioning well, so they might not be able to convert this drug into a prodrug. So the only way you could use prednisone as a prodrug is if the patient has no problems with their liver. Okay, so that's what we explained here. We also mentioned that okay, the OH group, okay, or also the reason why this OH at position 11 should stay as an OH instead of a C double bond O is because this OH group is required to form hydrogen bonds with the binding site, with the amino acid at the binding site of the glucocorticoid receptor. Okay, so when this is converted to the C double bond O, the ketone form, this form becomes inactive. Okay. The next example is the methyl prednisolone. In fact, from the name methyl prednisolone implies that a methyl group was added to the prednisolone. Here's your prednisolone structure, and then if you add a methyl group here, it was discovered that by adding a methyl group here, the glucocorticoid activity would increase 5 times compared to that of the hydrocortisone. Remember, the hydrocortisone is our reference point. At the same time, the mineralocorticoid activity will be gone, which is really very nice. So you have the methylprednisolone that is completely specific to the glucocorticoid receptors. It will have anti-inflammatory effect, but no mineralocorticoid effect. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And then it can be used systemically, and is also available in the free alcohol form for oral administration, just like in the case with the prednisolone. And I'm sure you have seen the mid-roll dose pack at the pharmacies, the 6 and 12 days mid-roll dose pack. These are all methylprednisolone. Okay. There are plenty of side effects with the use of these glucocorticoids or steroids in general, and that's why they are not used for prolonged amount of time. I'll let you look at these side effects by yourself, but just remember that because of all these side effects, these drugs are not used for a long time, and if they are used for a long time, then when it's time to stop them, we should actually taper off the dose slowly, like we saw in the case of the mid-roll dose pack 6 and 12 days. Okay, the next one, the next actually group of glucocorticoids are the ones used for inhalation. And if you remember earlier when we talked about lipophilicity, one of the reasons we increased the lipophilicity for these glucocorticoids is to prevent them from being absorbed when they are inhaled. So when we take these glucocorticoids by inhalation, if they are lipophilic, then it will take them longer time to be absorbed into the circulation, and we will have more of the local effect than the systemic effect, and therefore we will have less systemic side effects. So our goal here, when we design in the glucocorticoids for inhalation, is to make them more lipophilic. Okay. The first example is the piclomethasone dipropionate. The di actually is propionate means that we have propionate group attached to both of the OH group at 21 and OH at 17, and therefore this will make the drug more lipophilic. Now, since the 21 in particular is covered, the OH group here is esterified, then you should immediately know that it's a prodrug and it needs to be converted to the active form. Okay. Also, if you look at the changes here, for example, the chloro here at 11.9, the methyl at 11.16, and if you look at the table we discussed earlier, the structure-activity relationship table, you will be able to figure out that these two features will increase the alpha. The 16 beta methyl group would decrease the mineralocorticoid activity, and then the chloro, 9-chloro, would increase both glucocorticoid and mineralocorticoid activity. So at the end result, you will have a potent anti-inflammatory activity with little or no mineralocorticoid effect, which is the salt and water retaining effects. Okay. And I'm going to skip the side effects. This is something pharmacology you'll learn about in the pharmacology. And then the drug is metabolized to actually by the removal of the ester group from the 21. So instead of having dipropionate, one of them will be removed from the OH group at the 21, and you will end up having monopropionate, which is active. And like we said, because now if we remove one of the esters, if we remove the ester group from the OH at the position 21, this one here is important for activity, the OH group here. So now the drug becomes active. While if we keep this, it's not going to affect the activity. So it's metabolized from being a prodrug to the drug now, okay, which is the piclomethasone monopropionate, and it's now active and could give the anti-inflammatory effect. And then the dipropionate can also be metabolized into the inactive 21 monopropionate, which means if we, instead of removing the ester group from the OH, if we remove the ester group from this position, the 17, and we keep the one on the 21, then this is another form of metabolism. Then we'll have a product that's inactive, okay? Because remember, the 21 is the one that should be should be exposed. It shouldn't be esterified. Okay, so that's all about the piclomethasone. It's a prodrug, and it's converted into the active form. It can also be converted into another inactive form if this ester group here is removed, like I said earlier. Okay. So like we discussed earlier, all these concepts were explained, so if you only apply them, you should be able to figure out everything about this drug and the rest and the other drugs. Next one is the budesonide, which is the Pulmicort tubohalar. Pulmicort, or the budesonide, has diester groups at position 16 and 17, and if you look at the 21, the OH is free here, which means the drug is still active. Okay, so it is not a prodrug. On the other hand, it is not halogenated, meaning it does not have any of the fluorine or chlorine. So unlike the piclomethazone, which has a chlorine, so this one here is non-halogenated. Also, there's a chiron center here, and it was noticed that the R isomer is twofold more active than the S isomer. And that's basically everything which is important about this drug. 34% of the dose is inhaled, reaches the lung. The rest, and this actually would notice with most drugs that are inhaled, about less, the majority of the drugs are actually, go through the, the stomach, and only little amount of the drug reaches the lung. So that's why we care about how the drug, whether the drug could be absorbed systemically or not. Anyway, so and then once it's absorbed, the drug that's absorbed systemically is highly protein bound, and then it's metabolized and excreted in the feces or urine. Anyway, so the key points about the budesonide is, if you see that structure, since the OH group here is not hindered, it is not esterified, then it's active. It is not a prodrug. It does not need to be converted to anything. And then the presence of the ester group here would that's a new point actually, that's not being mentioned here, which is the esterification of these two would prolong, besides the fact that it would make it more lipophilic, it would prevent the metabolism of this sites here, and then it would prolong the duration of action. Okay, the next one is the cyclisonide, such as the brand name for it is the Omnaris or the Alvesco. And in this one here, you see that the OH group at 21 is esterified, and then the OH at 17 and 16 are also esterified through this cyclic cyclohexyl carboxylaldehyde, whatever that group is. And so because this one here is hindered at 21 is esterified, then it's a prodrug, it's not active, and it needs to be converted to the active form. Also, just like all these, there's a double bond here that flattens the ring and makes it more selective. Increase the glucocorticoid. It would flatten the ring and makes it more, increase the glucocorticoid action, at the expense of the mineralocorticoid. And what else? And of course, the presence of these also, in addition to the double bond, would delay the metabolism, so you will have longer duration of action. And the rest of the stuff about the availability and absorption you can read on your own. Okay, the next one is the flonisolide, or the brand name is called Aerobid. Again, if we look at the structure here, the OH here group is not esterified, which means that this is not a prodrug. It is actually active. It does not need to be metabolized to be activated. And the esters group here on the 16 and 17, it will increase the duration of action. It would prevent the metabolism, the same as with the double bond here. So the duration of action will be longer. On the other hand, the presence of the fluorine group here at this position, 6-fluoro, as well as the I already mentioned the double bond. So the presence of the fluoro would increase the glucocorticoid activity. Just like we mentioned at the table of the SAR, double bond, fluorine, these are things that would all increase the glucocorticoid activity and decrease the mineralocorticoid activity. What else? 20% 1% receptor affinity, same as the budesonide. 40% of the inhalers is available systemically. This is all something you can read on your own. Just extra information. So in fact, you should be able to extract the information about the selectivity again from the table. Okay, and you should be able to know whether this is a prodrug or not, whether it's active or not, also by looking at the C21 here. Okay. Next one is the fluticasone. It comes in two different forms. There is the Flonase, the nasal spray, and the Flovent, the one for inhalation by mouth. Again, by looking at the structure, there is no OH group here at position 21, but that was the only exception. That's the only functional group that could be used in the place of the OH, and then the drug would still be active. So this is not a prodrug. It does not need to be converted or anything. It's actually in the active form. On the other hand, the presence of this group here, the propionate, at the position 17 would give 36-fold enhancement to the glucocorticoid activity, to the glucocorticoid receptor compared to the beclomethasone, and twofold the affinity compared to the budesonide. And then the presence of the 9-alpha fluoro, just like we said mentioned in the table, would increase both glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoid, while the presence of the addition of a fluoro at position 6 would enhance only the glucocorticoid action. Okay, so I believe this one here is the 6, and this one here is the 9. So fluoro 6 position and another fluoro at the 9 position. Okay. Also, the effectiveness of the inhaled fluticasone is actually due to the local effects, while the systemic effect is actually has 1% bioavailability because it's extensively metabolized by the liver. In other words, the majority of the drug, just like all the ones that are inhaled, majority of the drug are actually taken orally, and then they reach the systemic through being absorbed orally, and then but because only 1% of the drug is bioavailable because it passes through the first pass effect through the liver, then it's extensively metabolized, and then the drug is metabolized and eliminated from the body. So the small amount that remains locally in the lung are the ones that produces the effects. Note that again, fluticasone propionate is available in two dosage forms. One as for inhalation, Flovent, another one Flonase for nasal spray. Okay, I think that's all for the fluticasone. The next one we're going to talk about is the mometasone furoate. The brand name for it is Asthmanix Twist-Tailor, and there is a number of unique function groups in this drug, the mometasone fumarate. In fact, the OH group here, so originally this is how the drug should look like, but then the OH group here was replaced with a chlorine, and apparently this chlorine, in addition to this function group, the furoic acid ester, in addition to the chlorine here at position 21, results in high affinity, high glucocorticoid receptor affinity, and it actually has the highest affinity among all the topical corticosteroids. So this this is actually not one of the addition of chlorine at position 21 is not one of the options that were listed in the table, so you might want to pay attention to that. So the addition of a chlorine here to the position 21, besides the presence of this group, would give unique feature to the drug. It would enhance its glucocorticoid activity and have the highest binding affinity to the receptor. And then the presence of the methyl group here, CH3 at position 16, would decrease the mineralocorticoid effect, and the addition of the chloro here at position 9 would increase both glucocorticoid and mineralocorticoid effect. And the rest is just, you could read on your own, and I believe that's all. So again, this is not a prodrug because although there's no OH group, but the chlorine here, besides this function group, has produced an active product. Okay. There's also a double bond here that would actually flatten the ring and makes it more selective to the glucocorticoids, just like all the other ones. The last example on the glucocorticoids is the triamcinolone acetonide, and if you look at the structural features for the triamcinolone and review the table, you would see that the addition of the 9-fluoro group increases both glucocorticoid and mineralocorticoid activity. Okay, and the acetonide function here would decrease the mineralocorticoid activity, and of course we have a double bond like we mentioned earlier, would flatten the ring, and because of that the triamcinolone acetonide has 10 times receptor affinity more than the beclomethasone and 6 times less than that of the mometasone. And by the way, I do not expect you to memorize how many folds each one is more, each one has higher binding affinity compared to the others. The major things, the important things I want you to know are if you are given a table, then make sure you're able to use the table and tell from the table what would be the effect of these function groups on any of these drugs. Okay, so this is the last example, and the rest here is again for your own. You can read it on your own. Basically, that only a small percentage reaches the systematic, but then it's metabolized by the liver. Okay, so that's it for this class of drugs, the glucocorticoids. Next, we're going to talk about the beta adrenergic receptors. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the beta-2 adrenergic agonists. Before we do that, I realized it might be better to actually talk about the types of adrenergic receptors and then go back to this page. So let me go to the talk about the types of receptors, and then we'll come back to this page. Okay, so as you know, there are two types of autonomic systems, the parasympathetic system and the adrenergic. The parasympathetic and the sympathetic. The parasympathetic one is the one that has the cholinergic system, and then there's also the sympathetic one, which has the adrenergic system or adrenergic receptors. So adrenergic receptors can be classified as alpha and beta, and alpha receptors are further divided into alpha 1 and alpha 2, and beta receptors are further divided into 3 receptors. The same applies to alpha 1. So you have alpha 1 A, alpha 1 B, alpha 1 C, and then you have alpha 2 A, alpha 2 B, alpha 2 C. Okay, so there are 3 kinds of alpha 1, 3 kinds of alpha 2, and 3 kinds of beta. Beta is divided into beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3 receptors. So there's a total of 9 receptors. Of course, the ones that are most commonly used for treatment of the asthma and COPD are the ones that target beta 2 receptors. Okay. However, so the ones that targets beta 2 receptors are the ones that we try to work on, because that's where beta 2 receptors are located in the lung. So we will design drugs that targets beta 2. However, because of the similarity between beta 1 and beta 2, there are problems associated with designing beta 2. So many of the beta 2 agonists can also affect beta 1 receptor, and leading to increase in the heart rate and force and velocity, which can increase the blood pressure. Okay, which is something to keep in mind when treating people with asthma. Okay, so this table here shows the receptor type and their location and the distribution and the response that occur by activating each one of them. Of course, in the heart, beta 1 activating this receptor will lead to increase the heart rate and force, and then would increase the velocity, the conduction velocity of the signal that travels through the heart. And then beta 2 is available in the lung, in the intestine, and the liver. And then in the lung, it causes bronchodilation, and in the intestine, it would decrease the motility of the intestine. You can imagine this, of course, by imagining the case of the fight or flight. So in the case of the activation of the adrenergic receptor, you're going to see the sympathetic symptoms of the lung dilation, increase in the heart rate, decrease in the motility of the intestine, and then in the case of the liver, you're going to see increase in the gluconeogenesis, which means the synthesis of the glucose. You're going to see a lot of synthesis of the glucose because now it's needed to get energy. And then you see increase of the glycogenolysis, so breakdown of the glycogen into its elements, which is the glucose. So again, you're going to see increase in the glucose. So this is another thing to keep in mind for people who have diabetes. Okay. And of course, in the uterus, you're going to see contraction, and again in the lung, bronchodilation. I'm sorry, here in the lung, it's actually the smooth muscle dilation. So both smooth muscle in the lung dilation and in the lung bronchodilation. Okay. So our goal is to design selective beta 2 agonists and avoid any effects on beta 1. And of course, we also want to avoid any effects on alpha 1 and alpha 2. Okay. Okay, so now that we have an idea about the type of adrenergic receptors, our goal, of course, is to design agonists for beta 2 receptors. Okay. So the question is, to design beta 2 adrenergic agonists, we need to know what structural features are present in an adrenergic agonist, and how to make this the molecule more selective to beta 2 agonist. To answer these two questions, we need to study the natural messenger, which is the norepinephrine that is produced to bind to these receptors. There is also another molecule called epinephrine that is mainly produced by the adrenal gland. So it's actually an adrenal hormone, and it's similar to the norepinephrine and produces the same effects. The only difference in structure between them is that the R group here is hydrogen in the case of the norepinephrine, and in the case of the epinephrine, it's CH3 methyl group. Okay, so let's look at the chemistry of these two natural molecules, try to understand them, and then understand their termination, how they are metabolized, and then next we'll talk about the structure-activity relationship for these drugs and their mechanism of action, and then we'll see how we can enhance the selectivity first to beta receptors, and then I'm sorry, yes, first to enhance the selectivity for beta receptors over alpha, and then we're going to enhance the selectivity for beta 2 receptors over beta 1. Okay. Okay, so the chemical nature of these endogenous molecule in norepinephrine and epinephrine is they are a class of catecholamine. Catechol means you have this benzene with 2 OH group. I described this earlier when we talked about the metabolism of the catecholamine molecules, and as you will see here, this drug is metabolized by the same enzyme COMT. So we'll talk about it very soon. So catecholamine is 1,2-dihydroxy benzene, and then you have on the alpha and beta position, the alpha position here, you have the NH, the nitro, so actually, I'm sorry, amino, and then at the beta you have OH group, so the full name would be beta hydroxy, and then ethyl, the ethyl group, and then amino dihydroxybenzene. Okay, so both of them have acidic and basic function groups. At physiologic pH of 7.4, since the pKa is 9.7, then both of these would be 90% ionized and protonated and act as basic drugs. Okay, let's look at the metabolism or the termination of these neurotransmitters, basically the fate of these neurotransmitters. And once we understand that, then we could actually see what are the ways available for us to prevent the metabolism of these endogenous molecules, and that would help us design in long-acting beta 2 agonists or beta agonists in general. Okay, so once these products are released, well, first of all, the epinephrine will have to be converted, oxidized by the cytochrome P450 into the norepinephrine. So the CH3 here is removed, and then you will have the norepinephrine, which is the one that is responsible for causing the beta adrenergic agonists. Now this norepinephrine, after it is released into the synaptic cleft, which is the space between two neurons, it binds reversibly to the receptor, and then after it binds and produces the adrenergic effect, it's now available back to the synaptic cleft, and then there are two possible pathways. One of them is being reuptaken into the neuron called presynaptic neuron, which is the neuron that when you released this endogenous molecule, norepinephrine. Okay, so that's one possibility. Another possibility is to stay in the extracellular space, the synaptic cleft, and move into the circulation. So those that are being reuptaken back into the neuron, they are metabolized by what's called MAO, the mitochondrial monoamine oxidase enzyme. Because if you remember here, this drug is kind of monoamine oxidase. So here's the amine. Monoamine enzyme can actually oxidize this drug and convert it into this form here. So norepinephrine will be converted into this aldehyde through the MAO, monoamine oxidase enzyme. Now the other ones that stays in the synaptic cleft and they diffuse away from the neurons, they can reach the circulatory system or they stay inside at between the synaptic cleft. These can be metabolized by not only the MAO, monoamine oxidase, but also by the COMT. Okay, and these are present in the synaptic cleft, and they are present in the tissues such as the liver, GI, and the lungs. Okay, so they can be metabolized by these two. And of course, if we can stop this metabolism, then we could enhance the duration of action and even the oral availability if we want to for these drugs. This figure here shows the metabolism of the norepinephrine first, or actually it could go either way. It could be oxidized by the monoamine oxidase first and then followed by the COMT, or you could start with the COMT catechol amine, the addition of CH3 here, followed by the MAO, and this would be the final result. And of course, all these products, this one here and here and here, all these three products are inactive. That's the only one that is active. This one, therefore, if we stop these enzymes, we could enhance, we can increase the duration of action. Okay. Next, let's talk about how these endogenous molecule, in particular the norepinephrine, binds to its receptor. So the receptor, the beta, beta-1, alpha, all these receptors are actually of the GPCR kind receptors. They are membrane bound receptors, okay, or transmembrane receptors. And these regions here, 5, 3, 4, and 6, they show, 3, 5, 6, and 7. These are regions of the receptor where the drug interacts with. And so you can see that, for example, this catechol part, the OH group of the endogenous norepinephrine, makes hydrogen bonds. And you have also ionic interaction with the aspartate amino acid here. And you also have another hydrogen bond. You also have some van der Waals interactions, hydrophobic interactions here and here with these regions. Also, the chirality of how these, the chiral center here is important, as you can tell. So the OH should be facing this way to form a hydrogen bond, while the hydrogen should be facing upway to form the hydrophobic van der Waals bonds. So the chirality here is important. If we switch these two, then you will lose these interactions. What else? So we talked about van der Waals, hydrogen bonds, hydroxides, and of course this is at physiologic pH. The amino group here is ionized, so it forms ionic interaction. So these shows the interactions and the features of the endogenous molecule that are important and required to exert its pharmacological effect. Okay, we will see how modifications to these will actually lead into loss of the activity, and we will also see that we want to maintain these features here to maintain the activity. Okay, so far we have described the endogenous molecules and how they bind to different adrenergic receptors. Herein we'll talk about the structure-activity relationship for the beta agonists in general, or the adrenergic agonists. Okay. First, we'll talk about the mechanism of action for the beta agonist. Apparently, there are 3 ways, or actually 2, and the third one is a mix of the first 2 ways. So 2 ways of how these beta agonists produce their adrenergic effect. The first one is through the direct binding with the beta receptor, just like the norepinephrine and epinephrine does. So they bind and produce the sympathetic effect. And this mechanism is called the direct acting mechanism. Okay, and then there's the indirect way, in which the beta agonist would either stimulate the release of the norepinephrine or inhibit the reuptake of the released norepinephrine from the synaptic cleft, or they inhibit the metabolism or the degradation of the norepinephrine by affecting the enzymes such as the monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Okay, so 2 different ways. The third kind of the beta adrenergic agonists are actually a mix of these 2. They might have a mix of both effects, so they could cause a direct effect as well as indirect effects. How do you know which ones? How do you know what is the mechanism of action for the beta adrenergic drugs? We can find out from the structure of that beta adrenergic drug. which will use this table. So we'll use this table to help us decide what would be the mechanism of action for a beta adrenergic drug. Okay, so based on this table, we will be able to decide to find out what is the mechanism of action for the beta adrenergic drugs. Okay. First of all, this is the general structure for any of these beta adrenergic drugs. This is the benzene ring, and we have one carbon, another carbon, so that's an ethyl group. This carbon here is called the alpha carbon, this is the beta, and this is the amino group, and the amino group is attached to an R1. Now at the alpha carbon there is an R2 group, at the beta there's R3, and then there's R4 and 5 in this ring. Now based on the substitutions on these R4, 5, and 3, okay, so we'll only use these three groups, R3, 4, and 5, we should be able to determine the mechanism of action for any beta agonist. In fact, we could use only the R3 and R4, and that should be enough to know what is the mechanism of action for these drugs. So just a brief or quick description. If both R3 and 4 have an OH, so this is R3 and this is R4 at the ring, if both have an OH, then it would be a direct. If none of them have an OH group, then it would be indirect mechanism. And if there is one of them has an OH, the other one does not. Actually, if the R4 has the OH but the R3 has an OH, then that's a mixed. Now we can imagine having another option where the OH group is here but not. So you will have OH here and OH here, but no OH here and no OH here, and that would be basically none of these. It wouldn't be actually an active drug. Okay, so these are only active ones that we are looking at. So in other words, we are missing two other possibilities. If you look at all the possibilities for these drugs, there are two more possibilities that are missing. These two missing ones, the drug will be inactive. Anyway, so for the beta agonists that are active, like I said, if we have R3, would be necessary, as well as R4. Now, if the R3 is in the R configuration, remember the S and R configuration we talked about when we looked at the way this drug interacts with its receptor. So if it's in the R configuration, that would be even optimal. So the affinity would be the best. Okay, so R3 is necessary, R4 is necessary. If we have these two, then we'll have a direct agonist. Now, if on top of these we have an OH group on the R5, then that would be optimal. Okay, so these two are direct, but this one is optimal. We'll have the optimal activity, and of course, if the R3 is also in the R isomer, then that would have the optimal activity. Okay. Now, if none of the R3 or R4 have an OH group, regardless of the R5, okay, then the mechanism of action will be indirect. So having neither OH on R3 nor OH on R4 would cause little affinity, and the result would be indirect action. Okay. Notice that the R4 and R5, one of them is in the meta position. In case you forgot your organic, we start counting. We start from this link here. The first one is called ortho, the second one is called meta, and the farthest one is called para. And the same applies here. So the first one is ortho, meta, para. So the meta position is the one that we're concerned about, or is the most important, in addition to the R3 here on the C beta. So the R3, R4, if none of them have an OH group, regardless of R5, then we'll have an indirect effect. Now, if we have one of them, either the R3 or R4, but not both, we'll have a mixed action. In fact, based on this table, if you have an OH group at R3 or you have an OH group at R4, then that would be a mixed action. I believe if you mix, if you inverse these two, basically if you have an OH here and OH here, H here and H here, then that would be probably inactive. Anyway, so based on these rules, you should be able to find the way these beta agonists work. Okay, let's now talk about the structure activity relationship for these beta adrenergic agonists, or generally speaking, the adrenergic agonists. In the previous paragraph, we talked about the mechanism of action based on the positions of these OH groups, but we did not specify whether they are selective to beta or alpha or beta 1 or beta 2. So in this next part, this paragraph, we'll talk about the selectivity. So to start with, the substitutions at R1 here can affect the selectivity between beta receptors in general and alpha receptors. So it was found that having a methyl group or even an isopropyl group, this is called isopropyl, and the name of the drug that has an isopropyl is called isobutyrenol. So having a methyl group such as epinephrine, or having an isopropyl group such as isobutyrenol, then the selectivity to beta receptors in general will be higher than to the alpha receptors. Okay, now further increase in the size of the R1. So instead of methyl isopropyl, if we increase it further and make it bulky, large, such as the tertiary butyl or an arylyl, which is basically having an aromatic and an alkyl group, then not only we would lose the selectivity to alpha receptor and the drug would be completely selective to beta receptors, but also it will also be more selective to beta 2 receptors. Okay, so by increasing the bulkiness of R1, we move from non-selective to beta selective and further to beta 2 receptor selective. Okay, so we will see that in the examples of the drugs we will talk about. We must notice that in all cases, no matter how selective the drug can become to beta 2, for example, receptors, if you increase the dose, if you give enough dose, high enough dose, then the drug can still bind to beta 1 receptors and alpha receptors and produce some side effects. So just keep that in mind. When you study the material, or when you apply these drugs, that if you have higher dosages, then the drug can still bind to the beta 1 receptors or the alpha receptors and produce some side effects. Okay, so it's not completely the selectivity is not completely lost. It depends on the dose. Okay. Now, as far as the substituents on R2, so R2, as you see here, is this here on the C alpha, which is right here, this carbon here. So as far as substitutions on this C alpha, also known as the R2 substituents, it was found that adding substituents to this position, such as ethyl group in particular, would actually prevent the drug from being metabolized by the MAO. If you remember, the monoamine oxidase acts on the amino group here. So in fact, from its name, monoamine oxidase, this is an amine group. So if we add a bulky group here, like an ethyl group in particular, then this drug will be protected from metabolism by the MAO enzyme, and then it will have a longer duration of action. Okay. In addition, besides that, the addition of an ethyl group here also enhances the selectivity to beta 2 receptors. Okay, so we could achieve two things by adding an ethyl group to the C alpha here. So by having an R2 equal to an ethyl group, you could enhance the beta-2 selectivity as well as protect the drug from being metabolized by the MAO, so it would have longer duration of action. As a side note, it was found that adding a methyl substituents would only slightly enhance the beta receptor selectivity. So it has to be an ethyl group, not a methyl. Okay. Nothing is mentioned about the protection from the metabolism, so it's only unique to the ethyl group. Finally, let's talk about the importance of the ring. If you remember, this ring is a catecholamine, which means it can be metabolized by the COMT. So if you modify this ring such that it's no longer looks like a catecholamine, then you could prevent the metabolism of this drug by the COMT, just like we have seen in the case of the phenylephrine and pseudoephedrine previously with the decongestants. Okay, so, and in fact, this is a general approach that you will always see in many other classes of drugs. Okay, so first of all, by modifying this ring to any of these, notice that it's no longer a catecholamine. Even though you have OH, but if they're not next to each other, it is not a catecholamine anymore. So then the resulting ring or the drug will be resistant to the COMT, and they will have a longer duration of action. And besides, these particular rings were found to enhance the selectivity to beta-2 receptors. So you could actually achieve two things by using any of these rings instead of that. The first one is enhancing the selectivity to beta-2 receptors, and second, increasing the duration of action. Okay, now these rules will be applied, as we'll see later on, just like we did with the glucocorticoids examples. So if we understand these rules very well, then we should be able to figure out how, what would be the mechanism of action and what features will the drug have, such as longer duration of action, selectivity, and so forth. Okay, just make sure you get and understand all these rules. Do not memorize them; they will be provided to you. So just make sure you can use them or you can apply them. The same here. So for this paragraph, do not memorize this table. It will be provided to you. Just make sure you are able to use it. Okay. Okay, so the first class of beta agonist we will talk about based on what we have seen so far. These beta agonists can be classified as short-acting, long-acting, and there's actually also ultra-long-acting. So the short-acting ones are given more than twice a day. The long-acting ones are given twice a day, and then the ultra-long are taken once a day. So the first one among the short-acting is, of course, the epinephrine, which is the endogenous molecule or the endogenous compound that's already in our body. In case you are wondering why don't we use the endogenous molecule, as you can imagine, this drug will not last longer in our body. It will be immediately metabolized by the COMT as well as the monoamine oxidase. However, it could be used for fast acting in the case of acute asthma, so it could be given by IV injection, okay, to produce immediate response. In fact, I have seen an over-the-counter product called Primatene, which is available as an over-the-counter drug, which is an epinephrine used for inhalation that could be used without a prescription in the case of acute asthma attack, but keep in mind that this is not the best option, especially when you talk about selectivity, because these drugs will increase the heart rate and the glucose and all these side effects. Another thing to keep in mind is that the epinephrine and in fact all the other catechols are chemically susceptible to oxygen and other oxidizing agents, especially bases and like chemical drugs that are bases, and as well as light, so it could be susceptible to light. So therefore these are normally dispensed with antioxidants or in an airtight containers, or containers that are protective from light. Also, if you look at the structure of this drug, you should be able to tell that it has a direct action mechanism. So because it has an OH group at the meta and OH group at this, so R3 and R4 are actually OH groups, so it has a direct mechanism of action. There's also an injection, the EpiPen. I'm sure you have seen that at the pharmacy. It's also epinephrine that is used in allergies, like in the case of anaphylactic shock. Then the EpiPen can be used in that case because it would enhance the ability to breathe. It would cause bronchodilation. If you remember the anaphylactic shock, the first thing that characterizes it is, besides the swelling in the face, is the inability to breathe. So this might be a solution in emergency cases. And I believe now in Texas these EpiPen are available as an behind the counter, so any pharmacist can use them without a prescription. It can be dispensed using a standing order, just like the vaccines. Okay, the next example is the metaproterenol, such as the brand name Allopent and Metapril. So again, look at the structure here, and you should be able to realize that, first of all, it has a direct actin because it has an OH group here at R3, R4, and then because it has the isopropyl, just like that, then it does have selectivity to the beta receptors, but not necessarily the beta 2. However, when combining this with this ring, so the presence of this ring, the resorcinol plus the isopropyl, then the selectivity for beta 2 is enhanced, but still we're not satisfied with this selectivity. We could still do better with the selectivity. What's interesting is that this group here, isopropyl, can also slow down the metabolism of this nitrogen here by the monoamine oxidase MAO. It is not as effective as having an ethyl group as well, but it still can slow down the monoamine oxidase. Plus, in addition, since this ring here is not a catecholamine, then it will not be metabolized by the COMT. So we have no metabolism by COMT and slightly metabolized or slowly metabolized by the by monoamine oxidase, and it also has some selectivity to the beta receptors. And what's interesting about these groups, in general, short-acting drugs, is that they have a fast onset of action. So as you can imagine, short-acting drugs are normally used for acute asthma, while the long-acting ones are used as a prevention. I believe that's all for the metaproterenol. And the rest you could read for your own. Notice that I highlighted them in gray because I'm sure they should be covered in more details by the clinical faculty. So you could read this for your own and relate this to what you learn from the clinical faculty. Okay. The next molecule we'll talk about is called terbutaline, which is known as Breathen or Breathair, the brand names for it. And if you look at the structure again, in fact, it's very similar to the metoprolol, except instead of having an isopropyl here, now you have a tertiary butyl. So you have actually 4 carbons, 3 in brackets here, and the 4th one is here. So you have butyl, but the way they're arranged is called tertiary butyl, which where the name came from, terbutaline, tertiary butyl. So because of this bulkiness, now it's more bulky than the isopropyl, like we explained in the structural activity relationship of the beta agonist. This would actually make it more selective to beta 2, and when it's combined with this ring, So having the tertiary butyl here, the bulkiness plus this ring, then the combination of these two would make it more selective to beta 2. So now we have the terbutaline, which is threefold more selective to beta 2 receptors. And since it has a non-catechol ring, then it will not be metabolized by the COMT. Also, since this bulky group is larger, then it will also slow the metabolism by the MAO. And so this would have, so the resultant drug would have a longer duration of action, but still similar onset to that of the metoprolol. Okay. And the next example is the bitolterol. The bi stands for having two toluic acid, two ester groups here. Tolterol stands for comes from this name, the cholesterol, which I'll explain very soon. So this bitolterol, forget about these esters for now. If you look at this drug here, which is similar to that, except the presence of the ester groups here, the toluic acid. So this drug here, first of all, it has a direct actin mechanism because you have an OH group at the meta position and another here at the C beta. So you have R3, R4 equal OH group, so that's a direct actin. Second, it has the iso, the tertiary butyl group, just like here. So it's more beta 2 selective. So in fact, I would expect this to be less beta 2 selective because the fact that it's not combined with a ring similar to that, yet it shows that it is as selective to beta 2 receptor as the isoethylene and the terbutaline. So anyway, but then again, because of the bulky group here, the tertiary butyl, the monoamine oxidase will be slowly acting, the drug will be slowly metabolized. But what's interesting is the way they modified the OH group here by adding two ester groups. So this is an ester group, this is another ester group, they are both the same. So by adding two ester groups here, they prevented the drug from being metabolized by the COMT, and the drug now has a longer duration of action. It could last as long as 8 hours, which allows the drug to be taken 3 times a day. I mean inhaled 3 times a day. Remember, all these are actually in drugs that are taken by inhalation. So it has a fast onset, which is nice, 2 to 3 minutes, but then it lasts for like 8 hours. And then once the drug is absorbed into the circulation, this ester group is broken to release this active form. So it's an example of a prodrug. So this is a prodrug that's inactive, and then when it's metabolized by the esterase enzyme, it's converted into this drug, which is the cholesterol, the active form, plus of course the ester groups here. So this is the mechanism of how the esterase breaks these two rings and remove these two esters and release the active drug. Okay, and if you compare it to the terbutaline, it's basically the same, except the ring here is different, the position of the OH groups here are different. Okay, the next example is our famous albuterol, sold under the name Ventolin or Proventil, as well as the albuterol, which is the R isomer of the albuterol, and it is sold under the name Zobinex, which is available in ampules for administration via the nebulizer, as well as the inhalation through the lung. Anyway, so albuterol, that's the structure for the albuterol. Try to look at the structure. First of all, it's actually not a direct actin because it does not have the OH group here. So in fact, it could be based on the table we have seen earlier, mixed actin agonist, because you have an OH group here at the R 3, and you have a hydrogen at R4, or actually basically no OH group at R4. So it's most likely a mixed agonist. So that's the mechanism of action. And then because it's not a catechol amine anymore, because we modified the OH group here by adding a CH3, by inserting CH3 between these two, so it's not metabolized by the COMT. And then because it has this bulky group, so first it is selective, very selective to beta 2 agonists, I'm sorry, beta 2 receptors, and this bulky group would protect this nitrogen slightly from the metabolism of the monoamine oxidase. It will not inhibit it completely, but still slow down the metabolism. So that would have a longer duration of action. So it has slightly longer duration of actions, and it's also more selective to beta 2. The duration of action is from 4 to 8 hours, so it will be taken every 6 hours or every 8 hours, and then you have the onset of action 5 minutes. So it's actually the drug of choice for the asthmatic attack. Now notice the star here at this carbon here means that the OH here could be on the up or down position, forming S or R isomers. And if you remember in the SAR, we mentioned that the R isomer is the preferred. So if you only synthesize the drug in the R isomer instead of the mix of both R and S, then you will have something called the Lev albuterol, which is the pure isomer that has the preferred position of the OH, and it is 4 times more potent. So this allows us to administer lower amount of the drug in the case of the Lev albuterol, okay, compared to the albuterol. The last example among the short-acting drugs is the pearbuterol, also known as Max Air. The brand name for it is Max Air. And if you compare it with the albuterol, it's exactly the same. The only difference is we replace the benzene ring with a pyridine ring. And apparently this ring has decreased the activity to beta 2, the selectivity to beta 2 receptors. And I'm not sure why would you ever consider using it if you have the albuterol. So this must be one of the examples of V2 drugs. Basically, pharmaceutical companies replace the group with another one that's an isosteric just to produce a different molecule, and then market it, and then as a competitive to the other drug. Anyway, so it's available as an inhaler, and there is some side effects. Like we said, it has a similar pharmacokinetic properties since it is no longer a catechol amine group, so it has longer duration of action, just like that. Selectivity to beta 2, although not as potent as the albuterol. So this will end our talk about the short-acting beta 2 agonists. Let's talk about the long-acting ones now. Okay, so long-acting beta agonists. The first example on the long-acting beta agonist is the salmeterol, also known as or sold under the name Serevent. It's actually available in powder for inhalation, although there is some issues about the use of the Serevent alone without the corticosteroid or the glucocorticoids. Anyway, so salmeterol, if you compare this structure, the salmeterol with the albuterol, you'll see that everything is the same except this part here, where drug designers got really crazy. If you look at the number of carbons and how long is the chain, you have 6 carbons, an oxygen, another 4, that's like 10 carbon long chain, a chain that's composed of 10 plus the oxygen, that's 11 atoms here, plus the benzene ring. So this is like the biggest chain or substitution to the nitrogen that we have seen so far. So we moved from compared to the albuterol, where we had an iso butyl, I'm sorry, tertiary butyl. We moved to having this weird long chain. As a result, first, the nitrogen is completely protected from the monoamine oxidase, so it's not metabolized at all. And then, just like with the albuterol, this structure here is no longer catechol amine, or it's no longer a catechol ring, so it's not metabolized by the COMT. And then, so that would increase the duration of action. Plus, as far as selectivity, because of this bulkiness, the drug is completely selective to beta 2. It has, great selectivity to beta 2 receptor, especially when combined with this kind of ring. Okay. Now the third factor is the lipophilicity. So lipophilicity actually plays an important role in the duration of action for the drug, because when you inhale the drug, if the drug is fastly absorbed into the lung, then it would have a shorter duration of action. But if it's lipophilic, it's gonna stay there and stay longer as it dissolves into the the fluids and get absorbed into the lung, so it will give a longer duration of action. And indeed, this drug has 12 hours duration of action, so it's taken only twice a day. So one puff twice a day is the dosage for the salmeterol. So let me see if I missed anything here. So it is combination, selectivity, potency, resistance to the monoamine oxidase, COMT, and also there's a postulate saying that this hydrophilic group attaches the drug to some place outside the receptor, and the drug stays closer to the binding site, and it keeps binding to the the binding site and producing the effect. That's why it has a longer duration of action. So it's just a postulate. It's not been approved yet. What else? Oh, and then there is a note that there is a small but significant increase in the asthma-related deaths among patients receiving salmeterol during a large clinical trial. Thus, the FDA has recommended that it should not be used as a monotherapy for asthma in either children or adults. And the recommendation is to actually use the salmeterol, use the combination of salmeterol with the steroid or the glucocorticoid fluticasone, which is the Advair discuss inhaler. Okay. The subgroup analysis suggests that the risk may be greater in Black patients compared to Caucasian patients. I'm sure you'll learn about this from the clinician, the clinical faculty. So I'm gonna not spend much time on this. I just thought it's worth mentioning. Okay. I think that's all for the salmeterol. Okay, the next example is the formoterol, sold under the formadil, or the R formoterol. R here stands for the isomer of the formoterol, as we'll see here. We'll talk about this isomer. So let's look at the formoterol structure. So first of all, you have this huge ring, okay, that would increase the resistance to metabolism to the monoamine oxidase. Plus, you have a different ring other than the catechol, so it's not metabolized by COMT. So this drug will be resistant to both monoamine oxidase and the COMT. This will give it a longer duration of action. As far as selectivity, this drug has bulky group apparently attached to the nitrogen, although not as bulky as this, of course. But anyway, it's a bulky group, and then when combined with this ring, it would increase the selectivity to beta 2. So it is nice. It has a longer duration of action, just like the salmeterol. It's taken once every 12 hours. The only difference between this drug, formoterol, and the salmeterol is that formoterol, as you can see, it's not as lipophilic as this, which means that the drug will be absorbed faster than this one here, so we'll have a faster onset of action. So again, formoterol has more rapid onset of action compared to the salmeterol, simply because of its greater water solubility. Okay. Now, if you look at this structure, you have two chiral centers. One is here, another is here. So 2 times 2, you can have 4 different isomers, and it was found that the RR enantiomer, okay, is active, and it was 1,000 times more active than the SS enantiomer and twice as potent as the racemic formoterol. So that's why the drug was designed into the RR form, and it was called R. Makes sense. The R formoterol, which is the RR isomer of formoterol, and will be more potent, and it is sold under the name Profana. Okay. And as usual, the stuff here in gray is for your own education. I'm sure you will visit these information with the clinical faculty. Finally, the last one is the indacaterol, sold under the name Arcapta Newhaler. It's actually not only a long-acting, it's actually defined as an ultra long-acting because it can be given once daily. So this drug stays in the body for 24 hours. So it has like 24 hours duration of action, which is the longest among all these. If you remember, the formoterol and the salmeterol, they had 12 hours duration of action. They're given twice daily. But the ultra long-acting is given once a day. It's like a capsule for inhalation. So you actually pinch the capsule and then you inhale it. And then you have the structure here for the indacterol. Again, you have the ring being modified. It's longer acetylcholamine, so it's not metabolized by the COMT. And then you also have this lipophilic. In fact, if you count the number of carbons here, we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So you have 12 carbons, which is very close to this one here. That makes it very lipophilic, and then also resistant to metabolism by the MOA. And then so it has many many reasons to make it longer duration of action. I'm not sure if there is more reasons to add to make it more longer, to have longer duration of action than this. I'm not sure why it has such a long duration of action compared to these two, but anyhow, so this is the longest duration of action we have so far. And it says here it's used only for the COPD, but again, this is a clinical faculty description. I mean, this belongs to clinical faculty people. They can be better describing the use of these drugs. So this will conclude our beta agonists. And we have seen the long-acting, short-acting, the ultra-long-acting, and do not memorize these information, but make sure you are able to use the structure-activity relationship and the table I provided you to extract the information from them, such that you are able to compare between structures and find out which ones has a longer duration of action, which ones is resistant to metabolism, and so forth. Okay, the next class of bronchodilators we'll talk about is the antimuscarinic. You can read these paragraphs on your own. It should be very simple. You have, I hope you still remember these from the pharmacology. But anyway, the muscarinic receptors are one of the two kinds of receptors available in the parasympathetic. One is the nicotinic and one is the muscarinic. Muscarinic receptors have 5 types, and the ones responsible for the bronchoconstriction effect is the M3 receptor. So all of them, of course, bind to the endogenous molecule called acetylcholine. So it would make sense in order to block the muscarinic receptor to study the acetylcholine and how it binds to its receptors, and then hopefully modify this acetylcholine and make something else that binds but does not activate the receptor. Instead, it would block the receptor, and that's why we are looking at antimuscarinic. Note that in the case of the beta agonists, we wanted to design something that binds and activates the beta receptors to cause bronchodilation, but in the case of the muscarinic receptors or the antimuscarinic drugs, we want to design something that would bind and block the receptor and not activate the receptor, because the receptor itself would cause bronchoconstriction, and we need to prevent that to prevent the bronchoconstriction. Okay, so here's the structure of the acetylcholine. Here's the muscarinic receptor, and you'll see lots of hydrogen bonds interactions here, and there is an ionic interaction. Our goal is to keep these interactions or maybe modify them, add another interaction with a hydrophobic region here or here, such that the drug is able to bind but not activate the receptor. So the drug should bind and produce a different conformation, a different change to the receptor, such that it does not produce the signal transduction effect. Okay, let's look at the structure-activity relationship for the anti-muscarinic agents. First of all, the first drug that was found to have, or the first agent that was found to have an anti-muscarinic agent was the atropine. And if you look at the atropine, it has all the features available in the acetylcholine. We have these OH groups and these C-double-bond-O forming hydrogen bonds. We have the ionic bonds, but then there is a benzene ring here that was added, and the goal of this benzene is to bind with the hydrophobic regions I mentioned earlier, such that it would form a different change in the conformation of the protein or the receptor. In other words, it would change the induced fit in a different way, in a way different than the induced fit resulting from the acetylcholine, and therefore it would block the receptor. So it would bind to the receptor but would not produce the signal transduction. And we have basically a chiral atoms here, and this one here was found that the R configuration is 100 times more active than the S isomer, which indicates the importance of this phenyl ring. So if it's in this position in the R, then it would bind tightly with the hydrophobic region of the receptor. Okay. And just like with the beta agonists, there are two kinds of antimuscarinics, the short-acting and long-acting. There is actually no ultra-long-acting in this case. So with the short-acting, the only example we have is the ipratropium, sold under the name atrovint. So this is the structure of the ipratropium. It's actually very similar to the atropine, except we added CH3 isopropyl here to the nitrogen here. So it's which makes it more potent, because it can bind to the hydrophobic region on the right side. If you remember in the previous page, there was a hydrophobic region on the left side and another hydrophobic region on the right side. So by adding a hydrophobic group such as the isopropyl here and the benzene, so then it will bind to both hydrophobic regions. So in comparison to the atropine, this function group will make it more potent. And just like the atropine has a short duration of action, it's given by inhalation. It has a fast onset of action, and it also what else? And it also the swallowed amount, the dosage. A lot of this drug will be swallowed, but since it's not absorbed orally, then it will be just eliminated with the feces. So we were not worried about the side effects. So the drug actually acts locally on the lung when inhaled. Okay. The next one, or the next class, so there was only one example on the short acting. Now the long acting, we have three examples: the tiotropium, or sold under the name Spiriva, and we have the glycopyrrate, sold under the name Cipri Nuheller, and the acrylonidium bromide, sold under the name Admiral. The first one, the tiotropium, or the Spiriva, the idea of designing this drug came from the scopolamine, which is an antimuscarinic, except this benzene ring was replaced with these two, I think thioneal rings, plus the CH3 here was added in addition to this one here. So now the drug is more lipophilic and it has a longer duration of action. And I'm not really concerned much about the rest of the information here. You can read it on your own. And then the next one, glycopyrrate, also will have these two rings that will make it more lipophilic. And then the last one is the acrylonidium you see the thionyl rings here as well, and then you see this long aromatic ring, the long chain here of that also makes it more lipophilic, and then that would increase the duration of action. So you have the Spiriva has a long duration of action, like 24 hours, which means it can only be taken once a day, and then the same applies to here. Actually, the glycoprate has a shorter duration of action. It's like 12 hours, so it's taken twice a day. And the last one is this one here, taken twice daily actually. So Spiriva would have the longest duration of action. Although I know with this long chain, I was expecting this to have the longest duration of action, but there must be some reason, maybe metabolism or something. But there is one unique thing about this drug, which is the addition of these weird features have led the drug to be more selective to the muscarinic 3 receptor more than the muscarinic 2. And the rest of this information you could read on your own. So already with the anti-muscarinic agents, there's not much to know other than maybe the mechanism of action and the fact that the lipophilic groups would increase the duration of action, and also the fact that when we designed these molecules, we wanted to block the receptor and produce a different induced fit than the one produced by the endogenous molecule acetylcholine, such that we would not see the bronchoconstriction.